April 14, 1945. Nuremberg, Germany. 0447 hours. The air tasted of cordite and wet stone. In the pre-dawn darkness, the ancient city, once the gleaming stage of Nazi pageantry, lay broken beneath a sky still bruised by the previous night's artillery barrage. Staff Sergeant William Holbrook crouched in the rubble shadow of what had been a burgher's house, maybe 3 centuries old, now reduced to jagged teeth of masonry and splintered timber. His breath came in controlled measures, fogging briefly in the April chill before dissolving into the haze of dust that hung over everything like a shroud. In his hands, he held a weapon that looked like it had been assembled in someone's garage from scrap metal and spite. The M3 submachine gun, the grease gun as every GI called it, weighed just 8 pounds. Its stamped steel body was crude, high utilitarian, ugly in a way that seemed almost deliberate. No fine machining, no polished wood, just cold metal pressed into shape by machines designed for speed rather than beauty, then riveted together with the kind of pragmatism that marked American wartime production. The weapon's cylindrical receiver, its skeletal wire stock, its blunt snout, all of it spoke of a design philosophy that valued function over form, survival over aesthetics. Holbrook checked the 30-round magazine one more time, feeling its weight, the slight play where it seated into the receiver. Around him, 7 other men from 2nd Platoon, Easy Company, prepared for what was coming. They'd been fighting through Nuremberg's medieval core for 3 days now, and every block was a nightmare of interlocking defenses, fanatical Hitler youth with Panzerfausts, and Wehrmacht veterans who knew they were defending the spiritual heart of the Reich. 200 meters ahead, across a crater-pocked plaza that had once hosted torchlit rallies, sat the objective, a bunker complex built into the foundation of the old city wall. 5 reinforced positions, mutually supporting, manned by an estimated 35 German defenders. Intelligence said they were SS, 12th SS Panzer Division remnants, men who'd survived the Ardennes and the Rhine and had chosen Nuremberg as the place they'd make their stand. The platoon leader, Lieutenant Morrison, had assigned Holbrook's squad to probe the rightmost bunker. "Find us a weak point," he'd said, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a man who'd been making life-and-death decisions for too many consecutive days. "We need to crack this position before full light, or the whole advance stalls." Holbrook looked down at the grease gun again. He'd drawn it from supply 6 weeks ago, after his Thompson finally gave up the ghost near Cologne. At the time, he'd felt cheated. The Thompson was a legend. Beautiful, powerful, the gangster gun that had become the symbol of American fighting spirit. And they'd replaced it with this stamped metal pipe that looked like something a plumber might have left behind. Half the guys in the company had made jokes. "That thing fire bullets or grease?" Private Chen had asked. "Looks like somebody sat on a real gun and this is what came out," Corporal Davies had added. Holbrook hadn't laughed. He'd spent an evening field stripping it, learning its simplicity, counting its parts. Compared to the Thompson's intricate complexity, the M3 was almost insultingly basic. But basic, he'd learned in 2 years of combat, often meant reliable. Now, as the sky began its slow transformation from black to charcoal gray, he was about to find out if reliability mattered more than reputation. The M3 submachine gun was born from a crisis of abundance and a paradox of American military thinking. By 1942, the United States was producing weapons at a rate that staggered comprehension. Factories that had made typewriters and automobile parts were now stamping out rifles, machine guns, and submachine guns by the tens of thousands. The Thompson submachine gun, that beautiful devil that had seen service from Chicago streets to Guadalcanal beaches, was a triumph of American machining. And therein lay the problem. Each Thompson required extensive machining operations, skilled workers, expensive materials, time, and a single Thompson cost the government approximately $200 to produce in 1942 dollars, equivalent to nearly $3,500 today. It took roughly 45 man-hours to manufacture one weapon using methods that required precision tooling and trained craftsmen. For a nation equipping millions of soldiers, sailors, and Marines, this was unsustainable. The Ordnance Department put out the call for something different. They wanted a submachine gun that could be produced quickly, cheaply, and in massive quantities. It needed to be reliable, simple enough for a conscript to operate with minimal training, and effective at the close ranges where most infantry combat actually occurred. And critically, yet it needed to be made using stamping and welding techniques rather than traditional machining, methods that could employ semi-skilled workers and repurpose civilian manufacturing capacity. George Hyde, a German immigrant and firearms designer working for General Motors' Inland Division, took up the challenge. His design philosophy was radical in its simplicity. Strip away everything that wasn't absolutely necessary. No milled receiver. Use stamped sheet metal. No complex fire control system. Use a simple blowback action. No fine wood furniture. Use stamped steel and basic wire. Make it so simple that it could barely break, and so crude that it didn't matter if it got dented. The result was the M3. It had just 41 parts compared to the Thompson's 65. It could be produced for approximately $20, 1/10 the cost. Home manufacturing time dropped to under 4 man-hours per weapon. The design allowed for production by factories that had never made weapons before, using techniques borrowed from automobile body manufacturing. The first M3s rolled off production lines in mid-1943. By war's end, American industry would produce over 600,000 of them, a number that would have been logistically impossible with the Thompson. But numbers on factory floors don't win battles. Weapons do. And when the first grease guns reached frontline units in late 1943 and early 1944, the reception was complicated. The soldiers who unpacked them looked at the M3 with a mixture of confusion and disappointment. This was what was replacing the legendary Thompson. This stamped metal tube that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd seen a submachine gun once, and from a distance, and then tried to recreate it from memory using parts from a hardware store. The jokes started immediately and spread through units like a virus. Grease gun became the universal nickname, derived from its resemblance to a mechanic's grease gun. Other names followed: the plumber's nightmare, the stamped wonder, the sheet metal special. Some soldiers, raised on Hollywood imagery of gangsters with Thompsons, felt genuinely insulted. Technical Sergeant James Kovac, a Thompson-carrying veteran of the North Africa campaign, recorded his first impression in a letter home. "They gave us new submachine guns today. They look like toys. Stamped metal, no wood, just this wire stock that folds up, weighs nothing, feels cheap in your hands. Half the guys won't carry them. They're keeping their Thompsons or trading for M1s. And I don't blame them. When your life depends on your weapon, you want something that at least looks like it was built to last." The complaints were widespread and often valid. The M3's rate of fire was slow, just 450 rounds per minute compared to the Thompson's 700. Its sights were rudimentary at best, barely more than a peep sight and a protective wing. The magazine release required both hands to operate. The cocking handle was a finger hole on the side of the bolt, easy to lose or damage. The weapon looked and felt like exactly what it was: an expedient wartime measure, designed for production speed rather than soldier preference. But beneath the crude exterior lived something remarkable that would only reveal itself in the crucible of close combat. April 14, 1945. Nuremberg, 0512 hours. Holbrook moved through the rubble with his squad spread in a loose formation behind him. The plaza stretched before them, maybe 200 meters of exposed ground churned by shellfire into a moonscape of craters and debris. In the growing light, he could see the bunker positions more clearly now. Reinforced concrete structures built into the medieval wall, with firing slits that commanded overlapping fields of fire. Whoever had designed this defensive line knew their business. The plan was simple, because complicated plans died the moment contact was made. They'd use the crater field for cover, move in bounds, get close enough to determine the bunker's blind spots and vulnerabilities, then radio back to Morrison with actionable intelligence. Simple. Survivable. The first 2 bounds went well. They moved in pairs, covering each other, using the craters and rubble piles for concealment. The morning was still too dark for good visibility, and the defenders, if they were even awake, gave no indication they'd spotted the American squad. Then Private Nguyen's foot came down on a piece of corrugated metal, and the screech of metal on stone cut through the dawn silence like a scream. The bunkers erupted. Muzzle flashes blossomed from the firing slits like malevolent orange flowers. The distinctive sound of MG-42 machine guns tore through the air, that terrifying buzzsaw roar that fired so fast it sounded like ripping canvas. Tracer rounds drew geometric patterns through the darkness, red lines connecting death to possibility. The Germans had been awake. They'd probably been watching the whole time, and waiting for the Americans to get close enough that retreat would be as deadly as advance. Holbrook threw himself into the nearest crater, the grease gun clenched against his chest. Around him, his squad did the same, veteran instincts overriding conscious thought. Private Chen landed hard beside him, swearing in a creative mixture of English and Cantonese. Corporal Davies slid in from the other side, his face pale in the muzzle flash illumination. "That's more than 35 defenders," Davies shouted over the gunfire. "That's at least 2 MG-42s plus rifles. Intelligence fucked us again." Holbrook risked a look over the crater's rim. The bunker line was fully alive now, every firing slit spitting fire. The rightmost bunker, their assigned target, was maybe 50 meters away, it close enough that he could see the concrete texture in the muzzle flashes. Behind them, the route back across the plaza was now a kill zone, swept by grazing fire from the center bunkers. They were pinned. Forward was death. Backward was death. Staying here meant waiting for the Germans to bring up mortars or grenades, and death would find them anyway. "We need smoke!" Chen yelled. "We need tanks! We need to get the fuck out of here!" But there was no smoke. The tanks were blocks away, fighting through the medieval streets where their armor was liability more than asset, and getting out meant crossing 200 meters of ground that was now being systematically shredded by machine gun fire. Holbrook's mind worked through the geometry of their situation with the cold calculation that combat experience taught. At the rightmost bunker, their target, sat slightly forward of the others, probably to extend its field of fire along the wall line. That positioning meant its rear and right flank were likely dead space to the other positions. If someone could get close to it, could get inside its firing arc. It was a terrible idea. Suicidal, really. 50 meters of broken ground moving toward the enemy instead of away, all while multiple machine guns searched for targets. But terrible ideas were sometimes the only ideas available. "Cover me," Holbrook said, his voice flat and calm in the way that men's voices became when they'd accepted something irrevocable. "Cover you?" Davies stared at him like he'd started speaking German. "Cover you doing what?" "I'm going for the bunker." "That's insane." "Yes, you'll be dead before you make 20 meters. "Maybe." Holbrook checked the grease gun's magazine, pressed it firmly into place, pulled the bolt back until it locked. "But staying here is definitely dead, and if I can suppress that right bunker, you all can pull back." Chen grabbed his arm. "Sarge, that's a suicide run. Let's wait for artillery. Let's—" "There's no time," Holbrook cut him off, not unkindly. That MG has our range. They're walking fire into the craters. In 5 minutes, we're all dead anyway. He took 3 deep breaths, filling his lungs, oxygenating his blood for what was coming. He thought briefly of his family in Ohio, of his mother's letters, of the girl he'd kissed before shipping out and probably wouldn't kiss again. Then he pushed those thoughts away because they were useless now, even harmful. Yet there was only the ground ahead, the weapon in his hands, and the next 50 meters that contained either his death or something else. When I move, pour everything into those firing slits. Make them duck. That's all I need. Just make them duck. Then, before his thinking brain could talk his body out of it, William Holbrook climbed out of the crater and started running toward the German bunker. The human body is capable of remarkable things when flooded with adrenaline and facing imminent death. Holbrook covered the first 20 meters in what felt like both an eternity and an eye blink, his boots finding purchase on rubble, his body weaving on instinct more than conscious planning. Behind him, his squad opened up with everything they had. M1 rifles cracking, a BAR hammering out long bursts, all of it directed at the bunker firing slits. As the German fire slackened for perhaps 3 seconds, just enough time for human beings behind those guns to flinch from incoming rounds, to duck, to experience that moment of self-preservation that combat soldiers constantly fought against. 3 seconds. Holbrook made another 15 meters. Then the Germans returned fire, and the world became tracer rounds and the sound of bullets cracking past his head with that distinctive supersonic snap that meant near misses. Something tugged at his jacket, a round passing through the fabric without touching flesh. Another kicked up concrete dust inches from his feet. 30 meters from the bunker now. He could see individual details, the way the concrete had been poured, the dark rectangle of the firing slit, even what might have been a face behind it. The grease gun in his hands felt light, and almost weightless with adrenaline. He brought it up as he ran, finger on the trigger, the weapon's wire stock pressed against his side. Not aimed, not really, just pointed in the general direction of that firing slit. 20 meters. A German machine gunner leaned into the firing slit, the MG-42's barrel swinging toward Holbrook, trying to track this insane American who was running toward them instead of away. Holbrook squeezed the trigger. The M3 opened up with its slow, deliberate rate of fire, a sound utterly different from the Thompson's aggressive stutter or the MG-42's insane buzzsaw. This was measured, almost rhythmic. Chug, 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 chug. 450 rounds per minute translated to 7.5 rounds per second, slow enough that you could almost count them, but slow meant controllable. The Thompson at 700 rounds per minute climbed, pulled, and demanded constant compensation. The grease gun, firing that same .45 ACP round from its heavier bolt and slower cycle rate, was like a steady hand pushing rather than a wild animal pulling. Even running, even with adrenaline turning his hands into bundles of trembling nerves, Holbrook could keep the weapon on target. The .45 caliber rounds, fat, slow, heavy, walked across the bunker face and into the firing slit. At this range, maybe 15 meters now, the 230-grain bullets hit with catastrophic effect. Behind the concrete, a German soldier died, his blood and the German concept of fighting to the last brick mingling in the darkness. 10 meters. Holbrook angled left, moving toward the bunker's right flank, where the geometry of the position meant the other bunkers couldn't effectively engage him without firing across their own position. Yet he could see it now. A door, probably steel reinforced, set into the bunker's side. A dead spot, exactly as he'd calculated, where the structure's own design created a zone the defenders couldn't cover from inside. He pressed himself against the cold concrete, gasping, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his teeth. Bullets cracked past from the other bunkers, but they were firing blind now, hoping to get lucky. He'd made it. Against all probability, against every reasonable expectation, he'd crossed 50 meters of killing ground and reached the bunker. Now came the hard part. The door was indeed steel reinforced, with a locking bar visible through a small gap. From inside, Holbrook could hear voices. German, urgent, confused. They knew someone was outside. They were probably repositioning, bringing weapons to bear on the door, preparing for what they assumed would be an American attempt to breach. They were right about the breach, wrong about the method. Holbrook pulled 2 fragmentation grenades from his webbing, gripping them in his left hand while keeping the grease gun ready in his right. The grenades were M2s, the pineapple grenades that were being phased out but still saw widespread use. 4 to 5 second fuses, lethal radius of maybe 15 meters. He pulled the first pin with his teeth, exactly like the training film said not to do, but every combat soldier did anyway, and counted 1 Mississippi. Then he kicked the bunker door 3 times, hard, loud, deliberate. The German voices inside went silent, then erupted in shouting. Holbrook released the grenade spoon, counted 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, then placed, not threw, it's placed, the grenade against the door's base where the gap was largest. Then he ran. He made it maybe 20 feet before the grenade detonated. The explosion was muffled by the concrete, but still loud enough to slap his back like a physical hand. Dust and smoke billowed from the bunker entrance. Holbrook didn't wait for the smoke to clear. He pivoted and ran back, the grease gun up, moving on that peculiar combat autopilot where training and instinct merged into something that bypassed conscious thought entirely. The door hung at an angle, its locking mechanism destroyed by the blast. Holbrook kicked it the rest of the way open and went in. What happened in the next 43 seconds would be reported, analyzed, debated, and eventually become part of 2nd Infantry Division's official after-action records. But the dry language of military reports could never capture the visceral reality of what occurred inside that bunker. The interior was chaos. The grenade had detonated in the entrance corridor, a concrete tube maybe 15 feet long that opened into the main fighting position. The blast had filled the space with smoke and dust, reducing visibility to arm's length. Emergency lighting, probably battery-powered lamps, created a hellish orange glow that turned the smoke into a living thing. Holbrook moved into this nightmare with the grease gun leading, his entire world compressed to a cone of attention extending about 10 feet ahead. Training dictated smooth movement, weapon up, finger indexed, ready to fire but not firing yet, not wasting ammunition on shadows. A figure lurched out of the smoke to his left, Feldgrau uniform, helmet, rifle coming up. Holbrook swung the M3 and pressed the trigger. 3 rounds, maybe 4, the slow rate of fire made each one distinct, and the German went down. Another figure, this one to his right, already firing. The rounds went wide in the smoke and confusion, sparking off concrete. Holbrook answered with a longer burst. 6 rounds, the grease gun's reliable feeding system sending .45 ACP bullets downrange without complaint, despite the weapon being canted at an angle, despite dust and smoke, despite everything. The M3's simplicity revealed its genius in this environment. No complex gas system to clog with dust, no delicate mechanism to jam when fired from awkward positions. Just a bolt, a spring, and a magazine, components so basic that they functioned through conditions that would have choked more sophisticated weapons. Holbrook advanced deeper into the bunker. The smoke was clearing enough now that he could see the main chamber, a reinforced space maybe 20 feet across, with the MG-42 position facing the plaza, firing slits cut into thick concrete, and ammunition boxes stacked along the walls. 5 Germans were still active. 3 were wounded from the grenade, moving slowly, disoriented. 2 were combat effective, trying to bring weapons to bear in the confined space where their rifles were unwieldy and his submachine gun was perfect. The close-quarters battle that followed was brutal and brief. In spaces measured in feet rather than yards, the grease gun's modest rate of fire became an advantage rather than limitation. Each trigger pull sent a controlled burst exactly where Holbrook needed it, without the Thompson's tendency to climb and spray. Watch the .415 ACP rounds, designed for exactly this kind of work, did terrible, efficient damage to human bodies at ranges where any hit was a fight-ending hit. When the magazine ran dry, 30 rounds expended in less than a minute of actual firing, Holbrook dropped the empty with his left hand, while his right pulled a fresh magazine from his webbing. The M3's magazine change was slower than the Thompson's, required 2 hands, was one of the weapon's acknowledged weaknesses. But everyone in the bunker who might have exploited that weakness was dead or dying. Holbrook stood in the sudden silence, his ears ringing, his hands shaking from adrenaline dump, surrounded by the consequences of the last minute. The bunker smelled of cordite, blood, and concrete dust. While the grease gun in his hands was hot but not burning, the slow rate of fire meant the stamped steel receiver hadn't heated to the point where the Thompson would have been uncomfortable to hold. Outside, he could hear American voices calling his name. His squad, probably thinking he was dead, now hearing silence from the bunker and not knowing what it meant. Holbrook moved to the firing slit and waved, showing himself, letting them know he was alive. Then he turned back to look at what he'd done. 7 German soldiers lay in the bunker. The MG-42 that had been raking the plaza sat silent, its ammunition belt still feeding into the receiver. Maps on the wall showed the entire defensive network, information that intelligence would find very interesting. And in the center of it all, still hot and smelling of burnt powder, lay the weapon that had made this impossible thing possible. The grease gun. The stamped metal joke. The plumber's nightmare. The weapon that had just cleared a reinforced bunker by itself. News of Holbrook's bunker assault spread through 2nd Infantry Division with the speed that only combat stories achieve. By the evening of April 14th, everyone in the regiment knew about the sergeant who'd made a suicide run with a grease gun and somehow survived. By the next day, the story had reached division headquarters. By week's end, it was being discussed in Ordnance Department reports as a validation of the M3's design philosophy. But Holbrook's action was not an isolated incident. It was simply the most dramatic example of a pattern that had been emerging wherever the M3 saw sustained close combat. In the Philippines, Private First Class Robert Chen, the same Chen who'd landed in that crater with Holbrook, would use his grease gun to clear a Japanese bunker complex on Luzon, expending 180 rounds through 6 magazine changes without a single malfunction, despite mud, rain, and the weapon being submerged in a stream during the approach. In Germany's industrial regions, where combat moved through factory complexes and urban ruins, soldiers began specifically requesting the M3 over the Thompson or rifle. The weapon's compact size, just 22 inches with the stock folded, allowed movement through tight spaces. Its slow rate of fire meant ammunition lasted longer, a critical factor when resupply was uncertain. Tank and vehicle crews, initially issued the M3 because of its size and ease of storage, discovered it was genuinely superior for their needs, and the weapon could be fired one-handed through the small hatches and firing ports of armored vehicles. It didn't require the strength to control that the Thompson demanded. And critically, its simplicity meant tank crews, who were drivers and gunners first, infantrymen only when things went wrong, could maintain and operate it with minimal training. After-action reports from the European theater began accumulating data that told a story the initial reception had missed. The M3, despite its crude appearance and modest specifications, had a malfunction rate significantly lower than the Thompson. In combat conditions, mud, dust, cold, wet, The stamped steel construction and minimal parts count meant there was simply less to break. Soldiers reported going weeks or months between cleaning without failures, but the weapon functioned through conditions that would have required constant maintenance with more complex designs. Perhaps most tellingly, soldiers who'd actually used the M3 in sustained combat began requesting it over alternatives. Lieutenant Colonel William Davidson, commanding officer of 3rd Battalion, 23rd Infantry Regiment, noted in his April 1945 report, "Initial reception of M3 was poor. Men perceived it as inferior to Thompson. After 2 months of urban combat, over 60% of submachine gun operators in battalion now prefer M3. Primary factors cited: reliability, ammunition efficiency, controllability in close quarters. Recommendation: continue M3 production and distribution." The weapon that had been designed as an expedient wartime measure, a cheap replacement meant to free up manufacturing capacity, yet had proven itself as something more, an accidental masterpiece of pragmatic design. But understanding the grease gun's redemption requires understanding what it represented beyond its technical specifications, what it meant in the larger context of American military ideology and the war's philosophical dimensions. The Germans and Japanese had entered World War II with weapons born from a fundamentally different design philosophy. The German MP-40, the Japanese Type 100, even the vaunted MG-42. These were products of nations that prized engineering excellence, that saw weapons as expressions of technical superiority and cultural sophistication. They were beautifully made, precisely manufactured, reflective of societies that valued craftsmanship and hierarchy. The M3 grease gun represented something almost antithetical to this approach, and it was a weapon that proudly declared, "We don't need it to be beautiful. We need it to work. We need it cheap. We need it now. We need so many of them that beauty becomes a luxury we can't afford and don't require." This was the industrial philosophy that had built America, the assembly line mentality, the standardization drive, the conviction that quantity produced at speed with acceptable quality was superior to small quantities of perfection. Henry Ford's Model T, the Liberty ship. And now, the M3 submachine gun. German soldiers captured in the war's final months, when interrogated, often expressed a kind of bewildered respect for American weapons logistics. It wasn't that American weapons were necessarily better, though many were. It was that there were so damn many of them. Every American soldier seemed to have whatever he needed. Run out of ammunition? More would arrive tomorrow. Weapon breaks? Here's a replacement. The abundance was almost obscene to soldiers from nations where a broken rifle meant scavenging parts from corpses, where ammunition was rationed, where every round counted because there wasn't another crate coming. The M3 embodied this abundance. At $20 a weapon, the United States could produce them faster than soldiers could lose them. The simple design meant repairs could be done by company armorers with basic tools. Parts were interchangeable. A damaged receiver? Swap the entire unit out, send the broken one back to be melted down and restamped. Sergeant Heinrich Müller, a Wehrmacht veteran captured near Nuremberg in late April 1945, Kian told his interrogators, "What frightened us most was not that the Americans had good soldiers, though many were very good. What frightened us was that it didn't matter if we won a battle. They would come back. Always they came back, with more men, more tanks, more everything. We could win 10 battles and still lose the war because they had more. They had factories we couldn't bomb. They had resources we couldn't match. And they gave their soldiers these cheap, ugly weapons that worked and never stopped working." This was the grease gun's true victory, not individual firefights, though it won those too, but the philosophical statement it made about industrial democracies waging total war. Quality through quantity. Excellence through reliability. Sophistication through simplicity. May 2nd, 1945. Salzburg, Austria. The war in Europe had 4 more days to live. William Holbrook, promoted to technical sergeant and awarded the Silver Star for actions in Nuremberg, sat in a captured German barracks, cleaning the grease gun that had become his constant companion. Around him, Easy Company settled into occupation duties, the fighting replaced by the strange, uncomfortable peace of victory. Private Chen sat nearby, writing a letter home. Davies was already asleep, snoring with the abandon of a man who no longer expected to be awakened by artillery. The barracks held perhaps 40 men, and the mood was subdued. Not celebratory exactly, but relieved. They'd survived. Not all of them, but enough. More than enough to remember those who hadn't. Holbrook ran a cloth through the grease gun's barrel, the simple disassembly that required no tools, no expertise, just hands and basic knowledge. Bolt out, spring out, magazine housing free. The weapon's internal components were already visible, accessible, understandable even to someone with no mechanical training. He thought about the bunker at Nuremberg, thought about the 50 meters he'd run while every law of probability said he should have died, thought about the German soldiers in that bunker, who'd fought hard and well and died anyway because they were in the path of something too large to stop. Chen looked up from his letter. "Sarge, you ever regret it? The bunker run, I mean. It was insane. You could have died." Holbrook considered the question while reassembling the weapon. Spring, bolt, magazine housing. Done. "Could have died staying in that crater too," he said finally. "Could have died doing anything. And the only thing I regret is that it had to happen at all. The brass is saying the war's almost over. Germany's finished, probably done in a week." "Yeah." Holbrook worked the M3's bolt, feeling the smooth action, the reliable mechanism. "Yeah, probably. What are you going to do with that thing when we go home? They'll take it back, won't they? Turn it into armory?" "Probably." Holbrook set the weapon down, ran his hand along the stamped steel receiver one more time. "Funny thing. Started out thinking this gun was a joke. Cheap replacement for the real thing. Now I'd trust it over anything else they could give me." Chen grinned. "That's because it saved your ass." "Maybe. Or maybe because it's honest. Does what it's supposed to do. Nothing fancy, just works. Doesn't care if you think it's ugly. Doesn't need you to like it. And just needs you to pull the trigger when it matters." "That's real philosophical, Sarge. You turning into a poet?" Holbrook smiled, a rare expression these days. "Nah, just a guy who learned to appreciate the simple stuff. The stuff that works when everything else fails." Outside, the Austrian evening was settling into dusk. Somewhere in this same town, German soldiers who'd been enemies yesterday were now prisoners. In a week, they'd be former enemies, just people trying to get home. The grand ideologies, the 1,000-year dreams, the certainty that had sent nations to war, all of it reduced to individual humans trying to survive until peace made survival mean something again. And in the midst of it all, a weapon that nobody had wanted, that everyone had mocked, that looked like a metal worker's mistake, and had proven itself exactly where it mattered, in the hands of soldiers who needed it to work. The M3 grease gun would serve in American military inventory far longer than anyone anticipated. Though production ended in 1945, the weapons themselves continued service through Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. Tank crews used them into the 1990s. Some saw action in Iraq and Afghanistan, 60 years after their design, still functioning. Still reliable, still doing the simple job they were built for. The weapon's legacy extended beyond its service life. It influenced post-war submachine gun design worldwide. The philosophy of stamped steel construction, simplified mechanisms, and production efficiency became the standard for a generation of weapons. The Israeli Uzi, the British Sterling, yet the German MP5, all of them owed debts to the M3's demonstration that crude could be effective, that simple could be superior. But perhaps the grease gun's greatest legacy was symbolic rather than technical. It represented a particular moment in American history when the nation's industrial capacity, its pragmatic engineering philosophy, and its democratic conviction that effectiveness mattered more than elegance all converged into an object that worked precisely because it wasn't trying to be anything other than what it needed to be. The Germans had sought perfection in their weapons, creating masterpieces of engineering that required master craftsmen to produce. The Japanese had infused their weapons with cultural significance, making them extensions of warrior tradition. The Soviets had embraced brutal simplicity, but with an acceptance of poor quality that made their weapons barely adequate. America, or at least the designers at Inland Division, had found a middle path, simple enough for mass production, reliable enough for sustained combat, effective enough to win firefights, and cheap enough that every soldier who needed one could have one. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't beautiful. It was American in the most fundamental sense, practical, abundant, and stubbornly effective. In the decades after the war, veterans like William Holbrook would return to civilian life carrying memories that television documentaries and history books could never fully capture. They rarely talked about the specifics, the smell of cordite, the weight of fear, the way time distorted in combat. When they did speak of weapons, it was usually with a pragmatist's appreciation rather than a collector's enthusiasm. But sometimes, at reunions or in quiet moments with fellow veterans, they'd talk about the grease gun, and they'd smile, remembering the jokes, remembering the derision, remembering the moment they'd learned that the ugly stamped metal pipe was actually exactly what they needed it to be. Holbrook kept a photograph from the war, not of himself, but of his squad outside Nuremberg, taken May 1945, everyone still alive and together one last time before shipping home. In the photo, he's holding the M3 loosely, casually, the way you hold something familiar. The weapon looks absurd in the formal portrait, out of place, unglamorous compared to the polished rifles and well-maintained Thompsons that other soldiers displayed. But Holbrook had insisted on including it, because that stamped metal joke had carried him through 50 meters of killing ground, had functioned when malfunction meant death, had proven that sometimes the ugly tools are the ones that matter most. Years later, his grandson would ask about the photo, about the strange-looking gun that didn't match the war movies on television. "That's the weapon that saved my life," Holbrook told him, "and probably saved the war too in its own way. Not because it was special, because it was good enough, and there were enough of them, and they worked when they needed to work. That's all war is in the end. Getting enough things that work to where they need to be when they need to be there. Everything else is just stories we tell afterward." The grandson, raised on narratives of heroism and glory, it seemed disappointed by this answer. He'd wanted drama, legend, the glorious mythology that war becomes when viewed from enough distance. But Holbrook had lived the reality. And the reality was that wars were won by logistics, by production, by factories in Detroit stamping out weapons fast enough and cheap enough that quantity became quality. They were won by soldiers learning to trust tools that didn't inspire confidence, by pragmatism overcoming pride, by ugly things that worked better than beautiful things that didn't. The M3 grease gun, mocked, dismissed, considered barely adequate, had cleared bunker lines, saved lives, and served for half a century because it embraced a truth that took most soldiers months of combat to understand. In war, nothing else matters except that it works when you need it to work, as everything else is aesthetics. And aesthetics don't win battles. Epilogue. The sound of simplicity. There's a sound that veterans of close quarters combat remember, a sound that becomes part of their permanent memory, whether they want it or not. For soldiers who carried the M3, that sound was the weapon's slow, rhythmic fire. Chug, 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 steady as a heartbeat, reliable as clockwork, unglamorous as everything else about the weapon. It was never the dramatic, aggressive stutter of the Thompson, never the terrifying buzzsaw scream of the German MG-42, just a workmanlike rhythm, measured and controllable, the sound of a tool doing exactly what it was designed to do without complaint or flourish. In the decades after the war, that sound became symbolic of something larger, the American way of making war, of making anything. It not with elegance or artistry or grand gestures, but with practical solutions mass-produced and distributed with an abundance that transformed quantity into a quality all its own. The factories that stamped out M3s went back to making cars and appliances. The workers who'd assembled them returned to peacetime production. The metal that had formed those crude receivers was recycled into 1,000 civilian uses. The weapon itself, that ugly thing nobody wanted, became a footnote in military history, mentioned briefly, then passed over for more photogenic subjects. But the men who'd carried them, who'd learned to trust them, who'd survived battles because the grease gun worked when more sophisticated weapons might have failed, they remembered. And in remembering, they understood something fundamental about the nation that had created such a weapon. America didn't win World War II because it had the best soldiers, though many were exceptional. Didn't win because of superior strategy, though strategy mattered. Didn't win through technological dominance, though technology helped. America won because it could produce enough good enough solutions fast enough that the enemy couldn't match the pace. Because it had an industrial philosophy that valued practical effectiveness over aesthetic perfection. Because it was willing to make ugly things if ugly things worked, to embrace simplicity if simplicity was reliable, to distribute abundance rather than hoard excellence. The M3 grease gun, stamped, crude, unglamorous, was the embodiment of that philosophy. A weapon that succeeded not despite its simplicity, but because of it. A tool that won battles not through superiority, but through reliability. An object that proved that sometimes the best solution is the one that works, no matter how it looks. And in the bunkers of Nuremberg, in the factories of Lausanne, in the streets of 100 contested cities, that ugly stamped steel pipe did exactly what it was meant to do. It worked. That was enough. That was everything. Chug, 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 chug. The sound of simplicity, the sound of abundance, the sound of democracy waging total war, the sound of victory, measured not in glory but in function, the most American sound of all.